The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Evening. I'm Donna Wares, editor of the LA Times Book Club, and tonight we welcome two writers of stories rarely told, the authors of acclaimed new books about the day-to-day lives of immigrants living in the shadows in America. Our first guest is Karla Cornejo Villavicencio, one of the first DACA recipients to graduate from Harvard and a 2020 National Book Award finalist this year. In her book, The Undocumented Americans, Karla shares the stories of immigrants in several US cities, including the undocumented workers recruited after 9/11 to help with the Ground Zero cleanup. She writes, I wanted to tell the story of people who work as day laborers, housekeepers, construction workers, dog walkers, delivery men, people who don't inspire hashtags or t-shirts. Our second guest author this evening is Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, author of Children of the Land. He's a California poet and a college professor. He was 5 when his family brought him across the border from Mexico, and his memoir recounts a life of displacement, fear, and hiding in plain sight while growing up in Northern California. We were always moving, he says. I wanted to stay still just once. Karla and Marcelo will be in conversation tonight with my colleague, editor Steve Padilla. They'll be talking about immigration, writing, and the recent election. We'll get started in just a moment by welcoming Steve and Karla to the LA Times Book Club. Hello, Karla. Welcome back, Steve.
Good to be here.
So these are crazy times like no other. And I wanted to start off by asking you both, how are you doing right now? Karla, how's it going?
I was muted. I'm doing great.
So you've had a busy day. You've been writing all day.
Yes, I've been, I'm pretty good at writing once I'm like on a deadline, like not close to a deadline, but on a deadline. And so I get rid of all of my rituals and superstitions and actually just write. So I wrote for like 8 hours straight today, and I'm fresh off of that.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I know we'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. And I'd also like to say shout out to Steve. Thank you for coming back to the book club. How's it going with you?
Well, I didn't edit for 8 straight hours today, but did work on quite a few stories and talked to some writers, and that was a great fun. In fact, that's I think a big part of my job. I should just quickly say, she said I edited column 1. That's this front page feature at the LA Times. It gets its name from the fact that it always started on the far left-hand side, first column of the page. There are no columns really on the internet, but we like the name, so we're not going to change it. And I guess the best way to describe them are just really compelling feature stories that could be silly or could be just tearjerkers. And we produce them all the time.
Well, thank you, Steve. This month we've all been talking about. Every month our community book hub picks a new books and new subjects, and this month we've been talking about Karla's book, The Undocumented Americans, and our second author who'll be joining us in a moment, Marcelo's Children of the Land. Karla, this was your very first book, and it immediately gained national attention and also became a National Book Award finalist. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience has been like?
Yes. It didn't immediately get national attention. It was a book that, so first, I tend to think of myself as a bit of a performance artist and someone who's really inspired by rock stars and pop stars. And I think of my books, because this is my first one, but I'm almost done with my second, and I have plans for a third. I think of them as albums. So this is what has informed me, music and pop culture obsessed millennial, with how I think about myself as a writer. And I don't let those scripts or boundaries define me. So this book was nobody really believed in it. Even people who thought I was a good writer and who thought that the book had a good message, nobody was willing to to bet on it. And what betting on it in publishing means putting money behind it. And there was no marketing budget. um, nobody, there were no, nobody was asked to blurb it. Nobody was asked to blurb it. And they pushed the book up, but there was no money to match the amount of press that I'd lose because of moving it up. So what I did, because I grew up undocumented, and if you read my book, you know that I believe that we're a class of people who believe ourselves to be like, hustlers, like, talented Mr. Ripley's. And I don't mean we lie, but we know how to get around things. So I took on the whole publicity thing myself. And my publicist did things that publicists should do, but I reached out for every single person for a blurb, and I contacted everybody. And when I am telling you that I contacted the Pope, I went everywhere. I contacted everyone, and I am someone who does not like to be fake or inauthentic. And I contacted people that I loved and genuinely believed in, which is why when you get the paperback in the spring, the blurbs don't make sense with each other. It's like Eileen Miles, like iconic queer poet, with Yara Judes, writer of In the Heights, and Selena Gomez, pop star. Like, these are people that I love, but that would probably not be in a room together. And the reason that the book became something people paid attention to was thanks to Latinx readers on social media who spread the word. And my book is in its 6th printing now, but you're like, that's great news. But that also shows that the publisher is very conservative about the number of copies it prints because they still believe that it won't sell. And I think that that's because of the voice of the book, and because it's not marketed towards white readers, it's marketed towards Latinos. And those are conversations that the industry should have, not me. But eventually people noticed, but people noticed once the Latino audience got mad and said, "You're not listening to us. We're telling you this is the book that we've been waiting for."
Well, we're looking forward to hearing more about your work. Before we dive into a more in-depth conversation, I wanted to just thank all of our readers at home for joining us tonight and invite you to share any questions you have for our 3 guests this evening. You can send them to the LA Times Facebook page. You can send them by email to bookclub@latimes.com. And I also wanted to mention, as regular book club attendees know, every event we have a partner bookstore. Tonight it is Skylight Books, and they have created a special page featuring both of our authors, and you can find their books there. And now I'm going to turn things over to Steve, and I'll rejoin you both a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. Karla, I want to follow up on something you just said about it not being marketed to a white audience, to white readers. But I'm curious, did you have an audience in mind when you wrote it? Were you thinking this is for a white audience, Latino audience, or any audience? Some writers say they only write for themselves.
So I really love drag and like drag queens, and I know some people, like people in their home, they put on the drag, they put on the glam, and they walk around like that in their homes. Dolly Parton, who's like a bio queen, puts on the hair, puts on the nails, puts on the makeup, and that's how she walks around in her home, because she says she does not want to walk out if her fire alarm rings. and she doesn't want people to look at her like without all that on.
Okay.
And then there are drag queens who do this for a living, and they are not going to wake up at 5 a.m. to beat their faces for 3 hours to sit in their living rooms and do a crossword. And so I'm one of those. I don't write for myself. I've never written in a journal. I don't write about my feelings. I have never written a piece of writing that was not going to have an audience. And, when I was younger, before I was married, I would write love letters to my then, paramour. And I would, write stories for my friends, things like that. But I started writing professionally when I was 15 years old, and I've always written to publish. So that's not a very
so that's the performance. That's the performance artist in you. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't read comments or anything. Once it's out in the world, it's just whatever. What was your question? I was going.
Well, you answered it great. I was wondering about, since you made a comment about that it wasn't marketed to a wide audience, and I was curious.
Well, that's actually an important question. I usually write for editors. I have close relationships with my editors, and I like working with editors for long periods of time. And I think that one way of becoming a better writer is by reading a lot and consuming a lot of different forms of good writing, like good songwriting, good comedy writing, and also by learning a lot from your editors.
Mm-hmm. What can you share something an editor has helped you discover?
My partner is my first editor, and she's taught me how to outline, because I don't know how to think chronologically, both in terms of sequence of time, but also how one thought can follow another, and naturally and rhythmically, or how one emotion can follow another in a way that makes sense to a person, in the natural order of things. That's not how my brain works. So my partner helps me outline my essays. For a long time, I worked with an opinion editor at the New York Times named Jim Dow, and he managed to splice genres so that I could use my voice, which is sort of manic and very visceral, and use reporting, serious reporting, as a technique, and fit those essays in an op-ed page in which you needed to have a call to action or to an opinion.
That astounds me to hear, this issue for you of how you organize those various themes. I'm surprised to hear that, because one thing that's remarkable about the book is there's several books going on at once. I mean, you're telling the stories of these undocumented immigrants. You're telling your story. In many ways, you're telling your dad's story, and all that's going on at once. And it goes back and forth very seamlessly. It's really quite astounding. So I find it fascinating that organizational can be an issue for you. Let me ask you another question about a comment you made to NPR. They were asking you about the book and about the undocumented Americans, and you said, quote, "I didn't write it for you to like it. I didn't write it for you to like it." What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't know what I meant by you then. If by you I meant the audience of Oprah's book club, then no, I didn't write it for them to feel inspired or blessed or feel like life had given them great bounty and we were instruments for them to feel anointed by God. That's not my purpose in life or my calling as an artist. And also, I am perfectly capable of writing those books and cashing those checks, but that would be bad writing. And I think that I'm probably incapable of bad writing. But also, I also don't think artists should care. I mean, there are some artists who like want to make people feel good, right? Like Ann Jeds or whatever that lady was who put babies in pumpkins or whatever. Like she was trying to.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Like we have a calendar in our house that we adore, which is a calendar of Pomeranians, adorable, spooky, ooky Pomeranians. That is art to make you feel good. My art is to illuminate, to humanize, to destroy caricatures, and to be beautiful. It's not to make you feel good. If you want to feel good, get a vibrator. I'm an artist.
I want to ask you about the person you dedicated the book to. At the beginning, you just give her name, Claudia Gomez Gonzalez. Hoping you could just tell the viewers tonight, who was she and why did you dedicate the book to her?
She was a young woman who was indigenous, and she crossed the border and was shot directly in the head by a Border Patrol officer. And there are a lot of these stories, but this one affected me because I saw a picture of her and she had this look on her face where she seemed so determined, and she seemed like she was trying very hard to contort her features so that she would look like Hillary Clinton taking like an official state portrait. You know, it was a great picture of her. And the reason
I
why
remember reading of her case, but how old was she? I don't remember. How old a woman was she?
I think she was 20.
Very young.
And she wanted to be a nurse, and that's the reason why she came here. And I remember thinking that if she had read about me, you know, like just a loose, very easy, very haphazard. If she had read my Wikipedia page, which I objected to getting, she would just have read like basically a LinkedIn profile of my accomplishments and not understood anything else that comes with migration. And she would have been like, everything is worth risking in order to get the American dream. And I would have been used as a tool to sell this pyramid scheme, which is the American dream. And so at the time, I felt like I was complicit in her death. And also, I understood that publishing this book, which I knew was great, and I was undocumented, I knew that it was bigger than me and it represented a lot to my people. So I wanted her to share in that accomplishment.
Do you still feel complicit?
Yeah. I feel complicit in a lot of things. I'm a permanent resident now, and I'm inching my way towards citizenship. And that's not something I deserved my way into. There is no meritocracy here. I fell in love with a tiny little American girl who looked like a heartthrob from a sitcom that I watched when I was a teenager in New York. And she happened to have been born in Berkeley, California. Unfortunately, I didn't know that was full of hippies. And she tries to give me homeopathic medicine. That's for couples therapy. But we got married, and I have a green card now.
Wow.
That doesn't make me more deserving or more legal or more did it the right way than anybody else. And so I think that every person who has privileges that they think they earned should consider the role of luck and the fact that luck is cruel, and that most of life and its privileges and its how easily we avoid death and precarity is just a game of Russian roulette. And so no matter how you live,
I think that notion of luck, I hadn't thought about it till now. I think also runs through Marcelo's book as well. Come to think of it, in fact, I think it's time to bring him on to the party now. Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, who is joining us from up in Yuba City, right, Marcelo, Northern California?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Welcome. And now, who's that on your lap? Is there an animal
Aw.
My
there?
dog is my
And you
dog.
want to share the name? I think there was some discussion of this earlier tonight.
Yeah, Carla was actually, we were just talking a little bit earlier. She was the first one in the 4 years that I've had him who ever made the connection between Kimchi and his name is Kimchi and one of my favorite drag queens, Kimchi, Kimchi Chic, I believe is her full name. Um, and I was trying to
Everyone else
remember,
thinks
like,
it's pickled cabbage. Okay, great.
yeah, no, and I got him on election night. I was driving about 3 hours away and coming back home in my car, and I picked him up. And there's like this little dog. I've never had a dog before in my life, so I didn't know what I was really doing. But I just didn't even equate it that it was the night of the election. Um, and as I was driving, just hearing the news, and we came home and I think it was around 7 o'clock at night Pacific Standard Time, so it was pretty well off into the election. And me and my wife just turned off the TV and just played with our new little puppy. Um, yeah, it was a very it was a very depressing time, and all I really could do was play reruns of Drag Race. Um, but yeah, that was
Wow.
really special, or something that she out of 4 years that she's the first one who made that connection.
Wow, I love that. Well, I want to ask you about another, well, we shouldn't call the dog Kimchi a possession, but another thing in your house. In a recent interview you did with the LA Times, you talked about your couch.
Yeah.
And I really like the comments you made about it. And I understood them more reading your book. And I think there's actually a message behind that couch. And now that's not the couch you're in right now, right? That's it. That's the
No,
chair.
no, no. Yeah,
Okay.
no,
Can you tell everyone about the couch and why it's significant for you?
it's weird. And first of all, like, I just wanted to. Oh yeah, there it is. That's my dog.
There it is. Okay.
Be on my couch on my Chase Lounge, um, which came with way too many pillows. Like I have to like get rid of some because it just has an exorbitant amount of pillows. But I was just gonna say I wanted to just continue listening to Carla because everything she was saying was just on point, and it's very few people who I can listen to and you know uh, and really identify in a way that many other people just don't. I had this experience with another writer who was formerly undocumented and who the few writers, the writers that I do know who are either undocumented or formerly undocumented, um, there's just this kind of silence that listening to Carlos, listening to what you were saying about the reader, about everything, just really has struck a really deep chord. So I mean, one of those things that I think it made me realize, think going back to the couch, is how weird a couch can act as a vehicle of such a milestone. Something that I never thought would act as a marker for having a kind of permanence that wasn't afforded to me even when I became a permanent resident. And also feeling that guilt, like I don't deserve this, or there are others who need this a lot more than me. If, and I say in the book, like if only I could trade it, or and I talk about the process of reproduction and making fake micas and everything, and micas that I used myself to work when I was younger, um, and just how much I have come, so much so to the point that a couch takes on just this enormous meaning of permanence, of owning something that I invested in, that was purchased you know um, with my work as a writer. It just meant a lot because we've never had a couch. That's the one thing that we've never really had that was new, that wasn't gifted to us, that wasn't from a secondhand store or whatever. I saw a tweet that said, "I'm looking forward to the day when I drive by uh, uh, furniture on the side of the road and I don't immediately say, oh, can I should I take that?" It's just
Well,
ingrained
it's
in me.
interesting. I think, one thing that strikes me is I think in both your books, there are moments where we see objects, little scenes, things that a lot of people just take for granted that are kind of kind of ripe with meaning in many ways, and that seems to be almost like I think a part of your technique. The Let me see. I want to ask you a quick question about how you open the book, Children of the Land. It begins with a fairly dramatic scene involving immigration agents. I wonder if you could explain, so why open it that way? And how did that affect the trajectory of the rest of the book?
I mean, it's almost funny because I didn't see that as like a dramatic entrance, even though I was gonna open with something else, and it was my editor. Going back to Carla's point, I really listened to my editor, um, to what they had to say about the function of the book, and I too am very scatterbrained. For my book of poems, I didn't put it together. I had a friend help me. I said, what is linearity and how do two things go together? And so the arc of my whole first book was pretty much I I gave it and said, what is this? For this book, likewise, it opens with that scene, but I wanted a boring book. It sounds weird, but I wanted a boring book. I wanted a book that aspired to the kind of life that I would one day hope to have. And that is one that is boring. That sounds weird to say, but I want a life that is uneventful, that in which I'm not constantly waiting for something. So the book, might open up on like on a seemingly dramatic score, but to me that was just another Tuesday. Even though it was a very important, it was a Sunday actually, but as like a popular saying would say, it was just another day. And yes, I had tremendous complications for the future for my family and everything, but it was just another day that cemented this um, urgency to protect myself and to guard myself and to hide myself.
And just so readers understand this much, I don't want to give everything away. They come looking for your father,
Yeah,
and that's why
yeah.
they show up that day.
Yeah, and I think from what I say in the book too, they too recognize the mundane lives that immigrants come to have a better life here, which is to be able to relax on a weekend, and so they too buy into that narrative that we are just like everybody else, in that on a Sunday afternoon we are resting, we are not expecting to have a raid come into our house. So, by their own admission, our similarities, they took advantage of our similarities to this American model of production and schedule. That is very different from many other places in the world, where people don't have that like 9 to 5 job, or 3 to 6, or however you want to um, delineate that. But
When did you, by the way, I was just the other day talking to Ruben Avives, a reporter at the LA Times who was undocumented, and as I recall, if I recall correctly, learned that fact when I think he just graduated from high school. He didn't know until then. I think he was applying to college. And
yeah.
by the way, he went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. And so when did you actually, both of you, just realize, learn that you were undocumented? When did the family let you in on that? Marcelo, how about you first, and then we'll go to Karla.
I had always known. There was never a time that I remember not being aware of that fact. And as early as my memories are super shot, just because of, I don't know, why they are, but I don't remember certain pockets, which is, again, a reasoning behind the structure of the book. It's very fragmented. But I always remember being in that state of at least knowing that there was something about me that I could not share with others. Maybe the complexities of the whole process and the whole documentation and the whole like behind the whole mechanics of it weren't as clear maybe when I was like in second grade, but I knew that there was something about me that I could not tell, and that was the fact that my parents couldn't drive. I knew that that was a fact that that they had to use certain kinds of paperwork that we would get. I always knew that.
Yeah, and Karla, what about you? When did you realize that you were undocumented?
I learned that I was undocumented when the AP changed their style guide to mandate the word undocumented. But I knew that I was an illegal alien from the time that I was a child. People called me that, and I took great pride in it because I was punk rock and I was like, of course I'm an alien. Like Marilyn Manson bites the heads off of bats. But I didn't like it when people called my parents illegal, or when they called them slurs, or when they told them to learn English or things like that. And then illegal immigrant became what was used in newspapers. And that sounded like a slur. And then people started, and then when undocumented American was like, what the AP and the New York Times started using, and then like very nice liberals started calling us undocumented workers or undocumented laborers, like to be super nice. And I was like you're just calling us like fancy workhorses. So it's just been a wild ride of terms. But yeah, I always knew that we were doing sneaky things in order to stay alive and not be, detained. But it was when I was 5, I didn't know what it was, and then eventually, the fog got a little clearer.
I see. Okay. Well, as long as we're talking about childhood, let me throw something at you. I want to now switch a little. I want to talk further about identity and immigration and things in your books, but let's go back to childhood, and you are writers, so I'm curious about the roots, the beginnings. What kind of readers were you as kids? Karla, let's start with you, and then Marcelo. What kind of readers were you two? And I'm curious if there was any particular book that really, influenced you in some way.
Like what age more or less?
Well, let's see. How about middle school? 7th grade, 8th grade, out there, if you like. Or if you prefer high school, if you want 3rd grade,
We can talk about Judy Blume if you want to talk middle school. High school was like, high school is where I become basic, and it's like Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell, all those sad folks.
All those sad folks? Did you like their work?
Yeah, I like the confessional poets, and also I was starting to get depressed and suicidal. And because I was brown and precocious and had big eyes and was pretty, my white teachers thought that was something to be encouraged and not something to maybe encourage me to go see a therapist for.
Wow. Marcelo, what about you? What were you like as a kid, as a reader, and if there were any influences?
Yeah, this might sound weird, but it might seem on brand for anybody who's read the book. But it really started off of envy. I wanted something that somebody else was able to do, and that was a classmate of mine in 7th grade. We all wrote an essay for class, and the teacher said, everybody turned in their essays. It was great, but there was one student who stood out above the rest, and I was about to to start getting up out of my seat because I was sure it was me. But it was my friend. It was actually my neighbor. He was my neighbor, and he talked about his brother's death, and how he was shot in front of his house, and being like being the only one who kind of remembered specific details. And I was like, oh, like I can't swear, but that was good. I really want that. I really want to do what he did. And so I guess that's how it really began. Is I think the book that I remember back, a little bit after like Ramona Quimby books and all those other books, it was this nonfiction book that was in my classroom about a boy being abused, called "The Child Called It," I believe. I can't remember who wrote it, but the name of the author. But I just remember like being glued to that book and not knowing what. And then afterwards, I would just, we used to sell stuff at, as Carla was talking about, undocumented folks are hustlers in a way that they make things work. And so my dad sold at flea markets. He sold fruit and old tools. So at flea markets, I would buy like all of these paperbacks, like James Patterson, all these trade paperbacks, and that's what I would do. Is I would just read all of this like really weird crime fiction.
And yet, you really grew into a poet. I mean, was there a linkage there? I'm missing what?
A high school teacher, who now has passed. Actually, I just learned of his passing. Who was long enough in the department where he didn't really feel like he had to follow any of the rules or protocols, and rather than showing us any of the standards of that we were supposed to learn in 11th grade as a junior, we just read all poetry the entire semester. And it felt like I was the only one who we learned how to scan. And that's where like I saw what was happening with like the English language in terms of meter. And like I remember almost like laughing, like, this is weird, right? And my friends were like, no, it's boring. And so that's like in terms of poetry, that's where it kind of started, is with that teacher. And I showed him like some terrible poems, and he was always mad, and he just said, well, this is okay, but it's not that great. And and I remember feeling really disappointed, but really determined to continue down that path.
Well, this relates to something I wanted to ask you, because a young writer asked this of me recently during a writing workshop, and she basically said, how'd she say it? She asked about, how does a writer find his or her voice? How do you find a writer's voice? And she was worried that she, one, didn't have a voice, and two, that she would never develop one. But she was writing, and I know what I told her, but that doesn't matter. But anyway, I think in some ways Karla actually answered this question earlier. But so, what do we tell a young writer for that? How do you find your voice as a writer? Karla, you want to take that one first?
I'd like Marcelo to go first.
Oh,
Marcelo?
No. Okay. I think it goes back to what you said, Karla, about who your audience is first and foremost. Because for me, I'm actually trying to go in the opposite direction and only write for myself, because I have also been in this mode of everything that I write was for a purpose and had a purpose, and that might be the pragmatic nature in me, and the way in which I was raised, in which everything had to have a purpose, everything had to have a benefit, or a cause and effect, or payment for this. We were working class, so nothing was taken for granted, and no work was done for free. So for me, everything was to be put out into the world, even at a very young age. So my voice was really outwards and trying to imagine what my reader would understand from mine. So if I were to talk to a young reader, I would ask them, first of all, are they more towards the exterior expression of their work, or more inwards? And I think that's where it kind of depends. I'm moving more towards, I want to write in a journal and feel free enough to just hit delete and never have to see it again, but knowing that I was able to write something for myself that wasn't going to be published, that wasn't going to be shown to anybody, and there's something freeing about that. So I think the voice is kind of balanced between there. And how you find that, I don't. That's as far as
I think one answer is you just keep writing, and you find it as you grow. I mean, I think one example of voice that's striking to me, Karla, in your book is this astounding one single sentence where you talk about Latinos being killed, basically, and you describe various methods and you use the word shoot. You say you talk about shoot and shoot and shoot. And I counted this afternoon, and the word shoot appears 42 times in that sentence. And I'm just curious, could you tell, I don't know if this is getting too micro here or not, but can you tell us how that sentence came about? I mean, it is rather extraordinary when it looks odd on the page visually because of the repetition, but when you read it out loud, as I did, it's really fascinating how it sort of builds in energy as it goes, and almost builds in anger as that sentence progresses. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I haven't said this in other interviews, but that was the exact number of times that Amadou Diallo was shot and during his murder. And I was about to turn 5 when I came to America, and somehow it's ingrained in my mind that that's my first memory of America, of like being here, of living here and living in New York. Like I remember arriving here, and I have like memories of my childhood here, but that's like my first big memory of like being in New York. And I looked it up, and I was older. I was like 9 or something, and I just remember every single detail about that. I remember the cops being acquitted. I remember Al Sharpton. I remember the protests not being as big as they should have been. And I remember my parents saying, we didn't think this could happen in America. So that moment was for me. It was a moment where I was showing that you could depict a violent scene without satisfying a morbid interest in a person of color's trauma and bodily desecration. And it was a way of paying homage to Amadou Diallo, who was a Black immigrant. And yeah, that scene.
Wow. Okay. Oh, I love that. For further question now, that's going to combine both writing and music. First, Marcelo, in your book, you describe these little chapters actually as movements, as in like as a symphony. So why choose that word? What's going on there for you?
I was really careful with what those would be called because I knew that structurally there had to be some kind of specification of individualized units, or I had to somehow, and I wanted to do something different, but I couldn't get away with that, and that was like completely start with a new page, so that there was the clear delineation between sections, and each section could stand on its own rather than like flowing seamlessly. So there were other words for those sections, and those words were a gesture, occasions, and there was others. The only one that stood in its place from originally was the opening one is movement as a trick cereal commercial, but they were all very surrealist in like their approach to the subject matter at hand, and like titled as a commentary on what was to follow. But ultimately, it landed on movements because of I think the natural progression that happened between them, and how they're telling a different story than what is being elaborated on in the 5 large chapters. And also, apart from music, the fact that those were ironically the parts where we were in place, even though they're called movements, and it's the longer sequences in which we're actually moving, in which what I talk about are movements between the borders, between the two countries, and my whole family's history of movement back and forth over the last 100 years. So I think it was gesturing towards that. the ceaseless repetition of movement that
Interesting, because it struck me as very musical, particularly in terms of the contrasts, like, allegro, adagio, that kind of thing. And Karla, so you mentioned conceiving, works. You mentioned the thinking of, rock stars, pop stars. Thinking of your works as really as albums. What I'm curious about, do you mean in the sense of thematically, or do you mean, or are you talking, or is the musical analogy more like micro? In other words, how you even structure a sentence? Is that the musical element here, or is it the larger thematic thing, or maybe it's both?
I'm still starting out in my career, so I'm looking to see how far I'm willing to take this project. But I'm thinking both in terms of like my book is essentially a book of essays, which could be read as a book or could be read as essays, which are like singles. They're thematically related, but each has its own flavor that is meant to represent or have the vibe of the city or neighborhood that I'm writing about. New York feels and sounds like New York, and it sounds like New York in the 90s. During the promotion of the Undocumented Americans, I had a very particular image because everyone described my book as a punk rock memoir. And so that was the aesthetic that I leaned into. And this aesthetic now is because I'm writing a young adult novel called Dream Girl. So that's a different era. And so I want for one day when I've done this for 20 years for someone to be able to look at a picture of me and know what book I was working on then, or to read pages and know, what year it was. I want to constantly be evolving the way that artists want their albums to sound different from each other, but they're from the same artist. So for me, those lines bleed together because some of my biggest influences in my writing are musicians like Meg White from the White Stripes. Her drumming is very important to the cadence of my sentences in those short, choppy sentences where you feel like you're about to have a panic attack. Fiona Apple's songwriting. There's, so many writers that have been, some of my favorite writers are musicians. So
going back to that, the sentence with the 42 words, aside from the symbolism that you mentioned there with the police shooting, what was the influence of rhythm on that particular sentence? I mean, there's a definite cadence to that thing. It's not just and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. There are variations on that.
Well, it was weird because when I was reading that part for audiobook, I couldn't get it right because it just came out of me at the time. I knew the number of shoots that I had to include, but the sequence and the order in which they came was, it wasn't like that complicated or it was ingenious or anything, but it just happened at that moment. And so when I read it for the audiobook and I had a really good director, I wanted it to sound like a freestyle would. Hip hop also heavily influenced the book. I listened to Kendrick Lamar almost exclusively, both for content and also because I love him as a lyricist. And I wanted it to sound like a freestyle, like when I was in high school, I went to a school where a lot of my classmates would have like freestyle battles in the stairways, and I know what that sounds like. And I'm someone who has a problem with ambient noise, like it overstimulates me and it makes me very like if there's a lawnmower outside, I have to close all the windows, and it like really stresses me out. But when there's like hip hop playing really loudly in a car outside, that doesn't bother me. So it was supposed to sound like a freestyle, but there's a sad, sort of confused, manic tone when it's read out loud, which I hope it is.
Yeah, well, I told you, I think earlier that as I was reading it out loud, I just thought it was sort of gaining power as it went along. You know, I want to ask about well, Donna mentioned this in the introduction. I think we should touch upon it. Is in your book you talk about undocumented workers involved with 9/11. The terrorist attack, and you introduced us to some interesting people. Could you tell us a little bit about why you focused on that? And maybe there were several. Maybe you want to tell us about Milton and Rafael, perhaps. Just curious about if you could share that a little bit of that part of the book with people tonight.
Rafael, I didn't get to meet. He died, and I just told his story based on what Milton told me about him.
Yeah.
And I thought it was sad that his firefighters are one of America's favorite professions to adore and to romanticize, and he was a firefighter. And they didn't care that he was a Mexican firefighter. They were like, come on, just join us in this heroic mission. And he got sick, and then his name was slandered and libeled across all of New York because he had problems with alcohol. And this is one of the things that became very important in my book to discuss, which is self-medication in the immigrant community. And it was also very important for me to disclose all of the magical substances that run through my beautiful body every day in order to keep me alive. And how sometimes I am not smart about what I take, and how all of that is tied to the people I've interviewed, and how it's tied to the pressure I feel to be a literal statistical anomaly in order to be able to just give my parents a dignified death when they age out of manual labor. And children of immigrants know that pressure. And immigrants who don't have health insurance, are you going to tell them to meditate? Are you going to tell them to take yoga? Are you going to tell them to go on an antidepressant? Like, there's only so much that a human being can do. And so the fact that he was stripped of his laurels of heroism because he had a problem with self-medication after the trauma that he had experienced as a first responder in 9/11 was monstrous to me, both because he was a Mexican national and because of the just insane expectations and stigma that we have around addiction and mental health in this country. And so Rafael's story was important to me. And I think that a lot of people in like mainstream media like to talk about like the stigma of mental illness in like the Latinx and Black community. But we have ways of talking about mental illness in our communities that maybe the mainstream press don't know about. And he was memorialized in the Latinx and immigrant community in New York. Like, people weren't, there was like a CD, people wrote these songs about him, people remembered him, and they fought the conclusions that the autopsy presented. Milton is someone who also has PTSD, and to the best of my knowledge, he doesn't self-medicate, but he struggled with suicidal thinking. And we had a conversation where I shared with him that I struggled with suicidal thinking. And that was one of the things that I shared with many of my subjects, which is like, we live in vastly different worlds. I went to Harvard, I went to Yale, I've been in buildings where there is ivy crawling up the walls, but migration has impacted us in similar ways. And if and it's hard to learn the skills to know how to cope with all of that.
This theme of mental health, it also runs through Marcelo's work as well. Marcelo, could you want to comment on this? What you've been hearing here? Also, I follow your Twitter feed, and recently you've been expressing concerns about just being able to keep it together. There's a lot of stresses on everybody these days, obviously, with the pandemic. I'm curious your thoughts on what Karla's just said.
Yeah, and I think, this book was written, contemporaneously with my life is an understatement, because it was literally written as a document of my mind and my substance abuse, without necessarily, seeking help. And I wrote this book, over the course of 3 completely of 3 years of complete downward spiral in addiction, and trying to just make it out alive. I'll never do this again, by the way. I'll never write another book like this again. I don't think I can, because it took writing this book and hitting that rock bottom to realize, to be diagnosed, formally, and start, taking medications to address that. Actually, I was taking medications during that, and that's one of the things that I was abusing, other than alcohol. But this, there was no other way to cope other than drinking. And a good friend of mine, her body just recently just collapsed because she didn't know how to, she had never been given the thought of, well, I should probably slow down, or maybe this is wrong with me, or talking about it. And so she was confused when she had her first breakdown, and she had to go to the hospital. She completely lost consciousness. And the doctors told her, oh, it's because your body just could no longer take it. And so I think for us, it's very difficult to talk about. And for me, certainly, my mom is translating my book right now. And I'm at the point where I want to tell her, just please don't, because I don't want her to see the kind of hurt that I had. And, it's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing struggle with, I think I'll just leave it at that. It's an ongoing struggle that I think is being fought, every day.
On a completely different set, I want to ask you about your work with incarcerated youth, but I want to just quote one thing to you from your book, Marcelo, and I was just curious if Karla relates to this in some way. What I find interesting, it's a section where you talk about the use of the English language, English in its role, and what it sort of symbolizes. And the reason this jumped out at me is the thought that you make your living with this language, and use it expertly. And this is what you wrote, about at one point in your life. I was afraid of the doctor because the forms in the hospital were official. They looked official, with their carbon copies and letterheads. They were written in the official language, English, and English could say anything it wanted. English could change its mind on you mid-sentence and then change back when you weren't looking. English could make you say things you didn't want to or mean to. It could make you agree to things you didn't know you were agreeing to. English was the language of small print. And yet, you use it expertly. There's got to be a love affair, at least by now, with this language. So I'm just curious about that statement and how you use the language now.
If I could write in Spanish, I would never write in English again. Even though Spanish shouldn't be romanticized as nothing other than a colonial language as well, with the same histories of colonial violence and genocide. But for me, it's more of the ideas, and English happens to be the vehicle. If I could paint, I would probably be a painter if I was good with my hands. If I could sculpt, I'd probably be a sculptor instead. there's a million different things that I would probably, if I could be, rather than a writer, only because I'm interested in the ideas behind them. And, whether or not I succeeded in conveying those ideas through language, can is up for debate. But for me, I think I'll always have that uh, mindset of trying to flip things over and over and over again, and seeing if I have something different at the end. So yeah, it
Carla,
is a
I'm
love
curious,
affair.
how do you feel about that, the relationship with English? I don't know if that, I'm just curious your reaction to that little segment I shared.
Um,
If
I'm
any.
fluent. I'm fluent in Spanish, and it's the Spanish that I use to talk to my parents, and the Spanish that I learned at church, and it's the Spanish that I use to talk to my subjects. I don't, there's this like big thing in Hollywood productions where when Latinas get mad, they like yell in Spanish. That
Yeah.
doesn't happen to me. When I'm experiencing like traumatic, like PTSD triggers, I forget English. I don't speak in Spanish, but I like mispronounce English words, or I like make up English words, sort of like I'm in ESL class again. So for me, it's not so much an attachment to language, but just a constant negotiation about um, the migration. I feel separating English from America and from where it came from and from imperialism and all of that. I feel like I found my home in English. And that has nothing to do with finding a home in America or anywhere else. My English is a New York English. It's specifically a Brooklyn and Queens English. It's an English that was fed by culture in all its diversity in New York City and in public school, in a very underfunded public school. And so I dream in English, I think in English, I write in English. When I want to, I wrote an essay for El Diario in New York about COVID very early on. I wrote it in English and then I translated it into Spanish. I can't be funny or my usual drag queen self in Spanish. I'm a good girl. Like I'm a good girl who needs to go to confession with the priest in Spanish.
In Spanish.
So
Okay.
sometimes language finds us.
Well, I think I saw an interview Marcelo did somewhere. It was about translation, and I forget if it was going from English to Spanish or Spanish to English. But I think you said, "I thought I knew." I think you said, Marcelo, "I thought I knew Spanish until you attempted that work." Um, Hey, one quick thing, Marcelo, I want to ask you to get this mentioned, and then we're going to bring Donna back to the party, and she's going to share a few questions from readers. You've been very generous with your time, folks. Marcelo, can you tell us a little bit about your work with youth? Incarcerated youth. What's that about?
Yeah, it's with a program funded by the state through a local arts council, regional arts council, the regional arts council here in my hometown of Yuba City in Marysville. It was called the Jumpstart program, in which I went to um, detention facilities and conducted workshops with kids ages 12, I want to say, through 17 and a half, up to 18, I believe. And it's taken a back seat because of COVID, and we're not able to visit visit anymore the facilities. And so I'm looking forward to coming back to that and being more involved. But it was it was difficult because I felt helpless at times, and I think the 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 ideal answer for this would be like it was such a rewarding, something that like a good white person might like to hear or say is, it was such a rewarding experience. I learned so much. But it was difficult because I was confronting a lot of the same triggers as them, and it was difficult for me to try to work through memory, both for me and for them, without trying to again reproduce uh, these structures of productivity and capitalism, and profit off of our pain. And I didn't want to do that. So it was really challenging. And I do want to do it again. And I hope that I become a better, I guess, teacher, or just mentor, um, because I was winging it, and I still am. I still am with my teaching, and how to teach uh, books that that offer some of my students representation like they haven't seen it before, but also not necessarily for the sake of the spectacular, as Carla was talking about it. That's one thing that I'm always battling, in my own work and in the work that I read, that I choose to read as well.
Yeah. Thank you, both of you, for these just wonderful answers and putting up with my questions. Donna, can you come back to the party here?
Yes, here I am, and thank you all. What a fascinating and important conversation. We've had some readers coming in with questions. And one of our first question is from Theodora. She's a Times reader who would like to know what books or stories, and what authors would you like to see in K-12 public education? How about Marcelo? How about you take that one first? What books should kids be reading, or would you suggest?
You know, I I really feel like kids should be reading contemporary poetry. Not just because I'm a poet, by nature, or because that's the craft that I came to study the most. But I have like Lucille Clifton. Like, kids should read Lucille Clifton and Neruda and Vallejo. It wasn't until grad school that I read some of these books, and only because I was in a poetry program. I think people shy away from poetry, so I would like to see more middle grade um, poetry being read, because it's not any more daunting or difficult than a lot of the other literature that is being taught. I think kids can take it on much more. I think I want to give kids a lot more credit, than I think a lot of people give them.
Well, any poets that you would suggest, that if kids are looking to get into it? Because it can be kind of daunting to find poetry.
Yeah, I mean, Ada Limon is a really great contemporary poet who is doing some really great work. Looking through, there's a an anthology for teens, called Ink Knows No Borders, and it's fantastic. It has a lot of really great contemporary writers in there who I think, if I were given that book in high school, I think it would have brought me in a more direct path towards what I ultimately wanted to do, rather than like spending 3 years studying European modernity, and then going back to being exposed to other writers, more diverse writers.
Carla, any book suggestions from you?
I'm writing a YA novel right now. So there's this book that I really love for teenagers, called The Patron Saints of Nothing, which I think is absolutely spectacular and has won a bunch of awards. But the imprint that publishes that and will publish me is called Coquila Books, and they publish underrepresented writers. of all ethnicities, nationalities, queer writers, and there's just a diversity of topics, stories, ages, families, different kinds of families. From like babies, they published like Ibram X. Kendi's like Anti-Racist Baby, and they're publishing my book, which is essentially like a novel about teenagers. So I feel like that's a really good imprint to check out if you want to look for high quality but like page turny books for young people.
Thank you. Those are great suggestions. Our next question comes from Dorani Pineda. And you spoke with her recently, Karla. She's our colleague here at the Times. And she wanted to know, what does a Joe Biden presidency mean for you as an undocumented, formerly undocumented immigrant? And what do you hope comes out of a new administration? Karla, let's start with you first on that one.
Man, it's bad to start with me with this question. I usually don't comment on policy in any of my interviews because I'm just not that smart and I don't have anything to say about policy. I leave it up to the very brilliant people who do know about these things. I'm obviously excited that Trump is out of office. Beyond that, I'm not an optimistic person. I remember when I was in the 8th grade, I'm 31, and my dad told me that the DREAM Act would pass by the time I was in high school. And I don't want to say anything else because I want to let young people who are feeling optimistic continue to feel optimistic. And a lot of young people follow me, and I'd like them to find joy and reasons to keep getting up every morning. And the Biden-Harris administration is a good step forward for us. And I'd like them to continue feeling optimistic because there are plenty of people who are already being the opposite of optimistic.
Well, thank you. Marcelo, any your comments on that that same question?
I feel like I'm also nearly too jaded for this question, merely because of, again, I'm 32, and I also remember back in high school thinking, oh, it's going to be anytime soon, so for me, yes, I'm glad that Trump is gone, and I hope nothing else happens to prevent that. And I am scared of what will happen on January 20th. I'm not gonna lie. But my father was deported under Bush. My mother was damn near tortured and detained under Obama. And we decided to keep a low profile in all of the 4 years of Trump because we don't necessarily, we kept backtracking all of our paperwork in my family because installing. Hopefully it would bypass Trump's presidency and be handled under Biden's presidency. But for me, it doesn't. It's difficult to kind of gauge what will happen only because of I know that the government deports, and I know that the government rejects applications, and I know that this is the nature of the government. So it's good that Trump is gone because of just the toxicity and the vitriol and the actual damage that he was causing communities, even if he didn't pass something, merely threatening to impose the, what is it called, the rule where if you had any kind of expanding the definitions of what government assistance would be and denying anybody who would be eligible for a green card or citizenship, that process, if they had ever applied for these services or received these services, that never passed, but it's suddenly in the public imagination, and it suddenly has the real effect of preventing people from moving forward with their lives because of those fears. So for me, a lot of damage has already been done, and my only hope is that some of that damage can start to be undone before anything else. Yeah.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from a reader named Kathy. And she wants to know, what is the focus of the next book that Karla is working on? Karla's talked about this a little bit, but at the beginning you mentioned 2 books. And then I saw on Instagram you mentioned a secret project as well. So I was hoping, Karla, you could talk a little bit about, you said 2 book projects, and then we'll turn it over to Marcelo. I'd love to hear what he's working on next. So Karla, take it away.
The secret project was just me trolling writers who humble brag and are like, secret project coming up. Like, just say what it is. But I do have a YA book coming up, which is called Dream Girl. And it is the sort of like the main plot device is that a young teenage girl in New York City, her dad has a deportation order, and he hides in a church taking sanctuary in order to give his lawyer time to fight his case. But in general, it's sort of like Patti Smith's Just Kids, but starring a young undocumented girl. And it's loosely based on my life as a teenager in New York who grew up in an evangelical family. But like I said, I started writing professionally. I became a music writer when I was 15. And it takes you through various different underworlds in New York, being undocumented, the jazz clubs, indie clubs, the music writing world, and New York City nightlife, like the East Village before it's been all of these neighborhoods before they have been massively gentrified the way they are now. And I was just like this kid who was super sheltered, but I discovered all of this downtown culture and like drag queens and sex workers and musicians. And my dad would pick me up from my shows at like 2-3 o'clock in the morning. It's like a very, very sexy, very New York coming of age story. But the lesson that I want to communicate to my readers is how you can, it's all about emancipation, my message to my young readers, which is like when you grow up idolizing your father because you see him as a martyr, because of how much he has sacrificed for you, how do you learn to see him as a human being who makes mistakes, isn't perfect, and maybe shitty sometimes, but still see them as someone who is worthy of respect and human rights? And so that's ultimately like something that we learn in the book.
Thank you. Marcelo, how about what's next for you?
I'm at the very early stages of working on a novel that talks about museums and pre-Columbian art that has like been plundered from other countries and displayed here in the States in universities and private collections and all of that, and talking about the facility with which those objects can cross borders, whereas the people to whom those objects, rightfully belong, and the places to where they belong cannot, and kind of just this cultural theft. So I'm still working through it, but it's at the very early stages.
Those both sound great. Thank you. So a final question from a reader this evening. We did have some other questions, but they touched on topics that we've already discussed. So this one is for Karla from a reader named Roberto. He had a multi-part questions, but he wanted to know, why did you feel compelled to write this book? What elements of the immigrant experience were missing from the narrative that you wanted to highlight?
Marcelo and I have talked about this, and Marcelo, you can chime in to talk about how we met. I think Marcelo should talk about how we met because this answers the question about what we both found lacking in stories about undocumented immigrants, and how when we learned about each other's existence and our books, we nearly nearly had a panic attack and like avoided each other forever. Marcelo, do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, we did, I think, and I had the kind of same panic attack just because you know I I felt my investment in the book was almost to the point of being scary that that I would relive a lot of what I had been through. So we both kind of were like avoiding each other because we were afraid, I think, of each other's story or something like that. So we finally got on this podcast and talked. And so we made a promise, and I asked, before this if it was okay, but we made a promise to, I don't know, Karla, do you want to say it, or is it cool?
Yeah, we were going to be on this podcast together, and our books came out during the pandemic, and I bought a copy of his book, and it was beautiful. But then I saw that it had dad stuff in it, and I saw that there was some childhood trauma stuff, and it was so honest, and it was so beautiful, and it was just too close to home. It's like you're walking through rush hour in the subway, and you smell your dead wife's perfume, and you're like, "Fuck, my day is ruined. Sorry for cursing." And I just was like, I can't read this book. I can't finish this book. Like, it put me in a bad place. And so then we both have a mutual friend and professor who put us on this podcast together. And we didn't know anything about each other, but we both did not want to talk to each other because he had heard me on This American Life and had heard excerpts of my book. And he had the same reaction, which is like, this girl is a great writer. Get her away from me. And on the podcast, we discovered that we have so many things in common, including his name is Marcelo, my dad's name is Marcelo, my middle name is Marcella. There's a lot to unpack. And we had a lot in common, and it was a really spooky podcast because we kept gasping and being like, "Stay away, demon." And then we promised each other we would not read each other's books because they would be so traumatizing for the other person, because both of us had done such a good job representing the traumas and the love and like just the reality of growing up undocumented with parents that you love but that hurt you. And I think that's the highest compliment we can give each other's books. And that is a long answer to say that most of the books that we had read about immigration had been written for a white audience. And I think young undocumented people wouldn't have read American Dirt and been like, "This triggers me, it's too real,"
Is this the first event, aside from the podcast, where you've seen each other face to face, or have you done other events together?
No, this is besides that. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, yeah.
So the reason that I wanted to have the two of you was I had read Marcelo's book when it came out, and then later read Karla's book, and I like that Karla's book was such an interesting story of other places in the country, and I had been so taken with yours being in California. So the idea of bringing this discussion together with the two of you, I'm so glad that you both wanted to come and join us tonight, and I'm glad you finally get to meet face to face. That's really wonderful. So this next question comes from me. We're always every month we have a book club, and we always like to talk about what we're reading. And I'm really curious. Each of you, there's a lot of books that we all read, and I read tons of books for work, but there's some of those books that really are that stick with you. And from a kid, I always read deep into the night, and when I have a good book, I still do. So my question for each of you, and Steve, I'd like you to jump on in this too, and maybe I'll start with you, Steve, is what's the last book that kept you up at night that you just couldn't put down, present company excluded? What other book has really captivated you?
One recent one, and this may sound really odd, what the book is. It was something I read, I think, in sixth grade. A book called North to Freedom by Anne Holm, who's a Danish author, and it's about a boy who escapes a concentration camp in Eastern Europe and makes his way to his mom. And I don't know why that popped into my head, and I think it also explains this fascination I've long had with totalitarian regimes. And I read that book again recently and just could not stop thinking about it. In fact, I think it's made me think that I should go revisit stuff I read in school that I probably will understand them in ways I of course, wouldn't when I was a kid.
Marcella, how about you?
So there's one book that I think has had that same visceral reaction that Karla was talking about just now, that we each had to each other's work. And I do want to say that the two other writers who said, one of them had to finish writing the book because they were going to talk about it. So they said it took them seriously like 3 months to read it. And the other one said, it took me a long time. So the one that I'm like caught in right now and I can't finish it because I have to keep putting down is this book right here, What Lies Between Us by Naomi Munaweera. It's just something in the writing, something about mother and child relationships that really has gotten to me. So that's the book that I'm trying to get through.
Thank you. Karla, how about you?
To be totally honest, the book that my partner reads to me almost every night is The Wind in the Willows.
Oh.
It has been a mainstay throughout the pandemic. We're on our second read through of it. I'm just so shocked by how funny it is and how the humor is so modern. The humor feels so contemporary, and the characters seem so contemporary. It feels like Tina Fey wrote it. I love it because it's gentle. Like, I can't watch television or movies right now because every plot twist, every confrontation just completely messes up my parasympathetic nervous system, and I just get really anxious. This is a very gentle book, but the character descriptions are lovely. The descriptions of their picnics are so beautiful. And I relate to the character of Toad. In fact, I told my book editor, Chris Jackson, I said, I have to send him a book proposal. And I said, I have my book proposal ready. And it was a page from Wind in the Willows where it was like, speech by Toad, song by Toad, composition by Toad. And it's just fully in character with my like Judy Garland persona. And it usually takes about like 3 or 4 pages of my partner reading it to me, and I fall asleep and I don't have nightmares. So I really love that book.
What a great suggestion. I haven't read that in a very long time, but I read that about 1 million times with both of my kids, and it's really one of my favorites as well. What a good suggestion. Well, I just can't thank you enough, Steve, Karla, and Marcelo, for joining us tonight. Just for anyone watching this who wants to share this conversation, it's going to be posted. It's live streaming, but it'll be available for watching at latimes.com. And it'll just be available for sharing, to go back and just listen to this, because I think people will really be interested in all of your comments and your book suggestions as well. That's something people always ask about, is how do I get listen to these great authors again? So we post them, and it's live right now on the Times site. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, for anyone who wants to be part of our book club in the future, latimes.com/book club, and sign up for our newsletter, and we'll keep you in the loop about upcoming books. And we also are always asking people, what books should we read together? Every month we read different kinds of stories. Marcelo, you mentioned poetry. We did an evening of poetry in September, our first. We had 8 Black poets in a time of unrest, and I look forward to any suggestions you might have for doing some poetry in 2021 as well. In January, we're going to be reading The Island of Sea Women. We're going to be doing a little historical fiction with Los Angeles author Lisa C., and that'll be coming up on January 20th, and that'll be our next event. And now I just would like to go back and thank each of our guests. It's really just been a pleasure chatting with you this evening. Thank you, everyone. Good night, Steve, Karla, and Marcelo. Good night. And
Karla, good luck with your deadline.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
All right, bye.